The jungle floor absorbed sound like cloth soaking water. Private James Holloway crouched behind a shattered palm trunk on Guadalcanal, his hands pressed against the wound in his thigh where a Japanese sniper's bullet had torn through muscle and artery. Blood pooled black in the volcanic soil. The date was November 8, 1942, and in the fading light of the Solomon Islands, he understood with terrible clarity that infection would kill him long before blood loss did. Around him, the campaign raged in its fourth month. The Marines had taken Henderson Field, but the Japanese refused to concede. Every night brought banzai charges. Every day brought artillery barrages that turned the jungle canopy into falling debris. And everywhere, in the mud and the heat and the endless rain, bacteria waited with patience that outlasted empires. The courtman reached Holloway as darkness settled. Doc Martinez moved with practiced efficiency, his hands steady despite the crack of rifle fire 30 yards distant. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He tore open Holloway's first aid pouch and withdrew a small envelope marked with stark military lettering. Inside, a yellowish-white powder caught what little light remained. Martinez dusted it directly into the wound, covering exposed muscle and torn vessels with a substance that looked like nothing more than industrial talc. "What is that?" Holloway gasped. "Something new," Martinez said. "The brass says it stops infections, says it's better than anything we had in the last war." Holloway had heard stories from the Great War. His uncle had died in a French field hospital, not from shrapnel, but from the gas gangrene that followed. Wounded men in 1918 faced odds that made combat itself seem merciful. A puncture wound to the abdomen carried an 80% mortality rate. A compound fracture meant probable amputation. Minor injuries festered into systemic infections that killed slowly, painfully, inevitably. But this powder, this sulfanilamide, represented something fundamentally different. It was the first weapon in human history that could fight bacteria inside a living body without killing the patient in the process. The discovery had begun 10 years earlier, not in a battlefield but in a German industrial laboratory, where a physician named Gerhard Domag was conducting experiments that his colleagues considered futile. The year was 1932. The place was Wuppertal-Elberfeld, where the enormous chemical trust IG Farben Industrie maintained research facilities dedicated to synthetic dyes. Domag had been searching for antibacterial compounds since 1927, testing hundreds of chemicals in a methodical campaign that yielded only failure after failure. The conventional wisdom held that no chemical could selectively kill bacteria without poisoning human tissue. The body's complexity seemed to preclude such precise intervention. But Domag persisted. His medical training during the Great War had shown him firsthand what bacterial infections did to wounded soldiers. He had worked in cholera hospitals in Russia, watched young men die from dysentery and typhus, learned to recognize the particular helplessness that came from having no treatment to offer. That experience shaped everything that followed. His chemists, Josef Clara and Fritz Miech, had synthesized a red azo dye they designated KL730. The compound incorporated a sulfonamide group attached to a benzene ring, part of an experimental series exploring whether coal tar dyes might bind to bacteria in living tissue. Initial tests in bacterial cultures showed nothing promising. The dye had no effect against colonies growing in petri dishes. Domag tested it anyway on mice infected with streptococcal bacteria. The protocol was straightforward. Inject mice with lethal doses of Streptococcus pyogenes, the bacterium that caused blood poisoning. Half the mice received the dye, half received nothing. Wait to see which survived. 26 mice received the injection of streptococci. 14 remained untreated as controls. 12 received a single dose of the red dye. By the fourth day, all 14 control mice were dead. Every single mouse that received the dye survived. The result was impossible according to existing theory. The dye had shown no antibacterial effect in cultures, yet it clearly protected against lethal infections in living animals. Something about the body's metabolism must activate the compound. Domag conducted more experiments through 1933 and 1934. The results remained consistent. The red dye, which Bayer named Prontosil, protected laboratory animals against streptococcal infections that should have killed them. But Domack hesitated to publish. He needed human evidence. He needed proof that what worked in mice would work in people. December 4th, 1935, provided that proof in the most personal way possible. Domack's 6-year-old daughter, Hildegard, was making Christmas decorations when a needle punctured her hand. The wound seemed trivial at first, but streptococci had entered the puncture site. Within days, infection had spread up her arm, despite multiple surgical incisions to drain the pus. The child developed septicemia, blood poisoning. In 1935, more than 75% of patients with blood infections died. The bacteria multiplied in her bloodstream faster than her immune system could respond. Fever spiked to dangerous levels. The treating surgeon recommended amputation as the only chance to save her life. Domack gave his daughter Prontosil. He calculated the dose based on his animal experiments, extrapolating from mouse weight to human weight, praying that the compound would work in his child as it had in his laboratory animals. Within hours, her fever began to drop. Repeated doses over the following days brought complete recovery. Hildegard kept her arm. In February 1935, Domack published his findings in Deutsche Medizinische Wochenschrift under the title A Contribution to the Chemotherapy of Bacterial Infections. The paper described years of animal experiments demonstrating that Prontosil protected against streptococcal infections. It did not mention his daughter's recovery. That detail would emerge later. The medical world received the announcement with skepticism. Bacterial infections had defeated every previous chemical treatment. Why should this red dye be different? Yet clinical trials in Germany during 1935 and 1936 produced undeniable results. Patients with streptococcal infections who should have died recovered after treatment with Prontosil. The death rate from puerperal sepsis, the childbed fever that killed thousands of mothers annually, dropped dramatically wherever the drug was used. In France, researchers at the Pasteur Institute, led by Ernest Fourneau, obtained samples of Prontosil and began their own investigations. The team included Daniel Beauvais, Jacques and Thérèse Trefuel, and Federico Nitti. They made a crucial discovery in late 1935. Prontosil itself was not antibacterial. The body metabolized the red dye, splitting it into two components. One component was the colored dye portion, which had no medical effect. The other component was a simple colorless compound called sulfanilamide. This finding had profound implications. Sulfanilamide had been synthesized decades earlier, in 1908, by an Austrian chemist named Paul Gelmo as part of his doctoral dissertation. The compound was well known to chemists. It had never been patented for medical use because no one knew it could fight infections. Now, suddenly, it was revealed as the active agent in Prontosil. Because sulfanilamide existed in the public domain, unprotected by patents, any pharmaceutical company could manufacture it. Bayer's hope for monopoly profits from Prontosil evaporated, but for medicine, the discovery meant that effective antibacterial treatment could be produced cheaply and widely. In 1936, President Franklin Roosevelt's son, Franklin Roosevelt Jr., developed a severe streptococcal throat infection. The 22-year-old was critically ill at Boston City Hospital when physicians administered sulfanilamide. He recovered completely. The case received enormous publicity in American newspapers. The president's son had been saved by this new German drug. Public confidence in sulfur drugs soared. British physician Leonard Colebrook began trials with Prontosil in July 1935, testing it against puerperal fever. His results confirmed the German findings. In England, the death rate from childbed fever had been 175 per 100,000 births before 1935. By 1937 and 1938, after sulfur drugs became widely available, the rate fell to 80 per 100,000. In just 2 years, sulfur drugs saved the lives of more than 1,000 English mothers. American pharmaceutical companies began producing sulfanilamide in massive quantities. The drug was cheap to manufacture and easy to distribute. It came in multiple forms: tablets for oral use, powders for sprinkling directly into wounds, solutions for injection. Physicians prescribed it for pneumonia, meningitis, scarlet fever, erysipelas, gonorrhea, and dozens of other bacterial infections that had previously been untreatable. Then came the elixir sulfanilamide disaster. In September 1937, the S.E. Massengill Company, in Bristol, Tennessee, released a liquid formulation of sulfanilamide. The chief chemist had dissolved the drug in diethylene glycol, a sweet-tasting chemical commonly used in antifreeze. He had not tested the solvent's toxicity. Diethylene glycol is a deadly poison. Over 100 people died, most of them children whose parents gave them the pleasant-tasting elixir to treat infections. The kidneys failed first. Then came convulsions, coma, death. The tragedy led directly to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, which gave the FDA authority to require safety testing before drugs could be marketed. But it was sulfanilamide's solvent, not sulfanilamide itself, that caused the deaths. The drug remained safe and effective when properly formulated. By the time war came in September 1939, sulfur drugs had become standard medical treatment throughout the world. German forces invading Poland carried sulfanilamide in their medical kits. British soldiers mobilizing for deployment to France received sulfur tablets as part of their field equipment. The drug that originated in a German laboratory would be used by all sides in the coming conflict. The mechanism by which sulfanilamide worked remained somewhat mysterious in the early years. Researchers understood that it did not kill bacteria directly. Instead, it blocked bacterial growth, giving the human immune system time to overwhelm the infection. The drug was bacteriostatic rather than bactericidal. It stopped bacteria from multiplying without destroying them outright. Later research would reveal the precise mechanism. Bacteria need folic acid to synthesize DNA and reproduce. They manufacture folic acid from simpler compounds using an enzyme that mistakes sulfanilamide for one of the necessary building blocks. When sulfanilamide substitutes for the correct molecule, the folic acid synthesis fails. Bacteria cannot reproduce. The immune system mops up the remaining organisms. Human cells do not synthesize folic acid. They obtain it from food. This difference meant that sulfanilamide could block bacterial reproduction without affecting human cell function, at least in most patients at therapeutic doses. The drug was not without problems. Some patients developed allergic reactions, rashes, fever, nausea. In rare cases, sulfanilamide crystals formed in the kidneys, especially if patients did not drink enough water with the medication. The crystals caused intense pain as they passed through the urinary tract. Newer derivatives of sulfanilamide, particularly sulfadiazine, reduced this complication by remaining more soluble at body pH. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the Army Medical Department faced a logistics challenge of staggering scope. American forces would fight across vast distances, in climates ranging from North African deserts to Pacific jungles to European winters. Wounded soldiers needed immediate treatment to prevent infections that could kill as surely as bullets. The solution was to give every soldier his own supply of antibacterial medication. Each man received a first aid packet containing a field dressing and a 5-gram envelope of sulfanilamide powder. The instructions were simple. Dust the powder directly into any wound before applying the bandage. The powder would prevent or slow bacterial growth until proper medical care could be reached. Additionally, soldiers carried 8 tablets of sulfadiazine, a more refined sulfur drug that caused fewer side effects than the original sulfanilamide. The tablets came in small, waterproof packets with clear instructions printed on the wrapper. Take 4 grams immediately after being wounded, swallowed with plenty of water. Unless the wound was to the abdomen, in which case take nothing, because sulfur drugs could cause diarrhea that might complicate abdominal injuries. The distribution of sulfur drugs to frontline troops represented a radical departure from previous military medical practice. In the First World War, wounded men had to wait for professional medical care before any antibacterial treatment could begin. Often that wait lasted hours or days, during which infections established themselves beyond the point where treatment could help. By the time a wounded soldier reached a field hospital in 1918, gas gangrene or tetanus might already be multiplying in his tissues. In the Second World War, treatment began at the moment of injury. The wounded man himself, or a nearby comrade, dusted sulfanilamide into the wound within minutes of being hit. The medication bought time. It slowed bacterial growth enough that the soldier could survive transport to an aid station, then to a clearing station, then to a field hospital, then to an evacuation hospital. At each stage, more sophisticated medical care became available, but the initial intervention, the critical first treatment, happened immediately on the battlefield. The statistics told a story of transformation. In the First World War, disease and infection caused 4 deaths for every 1 death from combat. Typhoid, dysentery, pneumonia, and wound infections killed soldiers by the tens of thousands. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 killed more servicemen than German bullets did. In the Second World War, that ratio reversed. Combat caused far more deaths than disease. The change resulted from multiple factors: vaccines against typhoid and tetanus, better field sanitation, improved understanding of disease transmission. But sulfur drugs contributed enormously to the improvement. They turned previously fatal infections into survivable conditions. The Pacific Theater presented particularly brutal challenges. American forces fighting across islands from Guadalcanal to Okinawa faced heat, humidity, and tropical diseases that European armies never encountered. Malaria struck more soldiers than Japanese bullets did in some campaigns. Dysentery swept through units, leaving men too weak to fight. Fungal infections, tropical ulcers, and countless other ailments afflicted troops operating in jungles where every scratch could fester. Japanese forces faced the same environmental challenges, but lacked the medical resources American troops carried. Imperial Japan had not developed sulfur drug production on a meaningful scale. Japanese soldiers wounded in combat received traditional wound care, cleaning, bandaging, prayer, but no antibacterial medication that could prevent infection from taking hold. The disparity showed in casualty statistics. American soldiers in the Pacific survived wounds at rates the previous generation would have considered miraculous. Approximately 70% of wounded American servicemen recovered and returned to duty or survived to go home. Japanese soldiers often died from infections that started in relatively minor wounds. Dysentery epidemics ravaged Japanese units trapped on isolated islands where resupply became impossible. The difference was not a matter of courage or fighting spirit. Japanese soldiers fought with legendary determination, but determination could not overcome bacterial infections. A streptococcal wound infection multiplied at exponential rates whether its host was brave or cowardly. Dysentery bacteria did not care about Bushido. The side with effective antibacterial drugs saved soldiers who would have died in any previous war. Private Holloway survived the night on Guadalcanal. The sulfanilamide powder Martinez had dusted into his thigh wound slowed the bacterial growth enough that his immune system could begin fighting back. By dawn, stretcher bearers evacuated him to the battalion aid station, where a medical officer cleaned the wound properly, administered morphine for pain, and gave him tablets of sulfadiazine to take orally. 3 days later, Holloway was aboard a hospital ship bound for a rear area facility. The wound showed no signs of gas gangrene or other serious infection. His fever remained low. The muscle damage would heal with time. In 1918, his odds of survival would have been perhaps 20%. In 1942, with sulfur drugs, his odds exceeded 90%. The European theatre presented different challenges but similar solutions. American and British forces fighting across North Africa, then Italy, then France encountered cold, mud, and conditions that bred different varieties of bacterial infection. Pneumonia struck men sleeping in frozen foxholes. Trench foot, caused partly by bacterial infection of damaged tissue, disabled thousands. Meningitis swept through crowded troop ships. Sulfur drugs treated all these conditions with varying degrees of success. They were most effective against streptococcal and pneumococcal infections. Meningococcal meningitis, which had terrified military commanders since ancient times, responded dramatically to sulfadiazine treatment. In the First World War, Meningitis killed more than 70% of infected soldiers. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In the Second World War, with sulfur drugs, mortality dropped below 10% in units with good medical support. The drugs were less effective against some infections. Gram-negative bacteria, like those causing most dysentery, did not respond well to sulfur treatment. Tuberculosis required different medications. Viral infections, of course, could not be treated with antibacterial drugs at all. But for the broad range of common bacterial infections that plagued armies throughout history, sulfur drugs provided effective treatment for the first time. American pharmaceutical companies produced sulfur drugs in staggering quantities during the war. Squibb, Upjohn, Lederle, Parke Davis, and dozens of other firms manufactured hundreds of tons of sulfanilamide, sulfadiazine, sulfadiazole, and related compounds. The production effort represented one of the first examples of mass production of synthetic pharmaceuticals. The pills and powders that emerged from American factories by the millions saved lives on every continent where American forces fought. The British provided sulfur drugs to American forces under reverse Lend-Lease arrangements, recognizing that fighting effectiveness depended on keeping troops healthy. 9,600 flak jackets were not the only British contribution. Sulfur drugs manufactured in Britain went to American units throughout 1942 and 1943 until American production fully ramped up. By 1943, medical officers had accumulated enough experience with sulfur drugs to refine their protocols. The initial enthusiasm for dusting wounds with sulfanilamide powder gave way to more cautious approaches. Doctors noticed that the powder sometimes acted as a foreign body in wounds, like a splinter, hindering healing rather than helping it. The powder made wounds dirtier, and it often failed to reach the deepest parts where infection began. In July 1944, the surgeon of the 1st U.S. Army recommended abandoning the practice of sprinkling sulfur powder directly into fresh wounds. The tablets remained effective when taken orally, flooding the bloodstream with antibacterial compounds that reached infected tissue through circulation. But the powder, for all its symbolic importance and early promise, proved less useful than initially hoped. The recommendation sparked controversy. Many medics had seen sulfanilamide powder save lives in the early years of the war. They trusted it. Changing established procedures during combat operations was always difficult, but the medical evidence was clear. Oral sulfur drugs worked better than topical powder for most wounds. By January 1945, the policy officially changed. Soldiers no longer carried the small envelope of powder in their first aid kits. Meanwhile, another antibacterial drug was emerging from British and American laboratories. Penicillin, discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928 and developed for mass production by Howard Florey and his team at Oxford, proved even more effective than sulfur drugs against many infections. Penicillin killed bacteria directly rather than merely stopping their growth. It worked against infections that sulfur drugs could not treat, and it caused fewer side effects. By 1944, penicillin production was accelerating rapidly. The drug was initially scarce, reserved for the most serious cases. But American pharmaceutical companies, working with British researchers, solved the production challenges. By D-Day in June 1944, there was enough penicillin to treat all Allied wounded who needed it. The wounded men coming off the Normandy beaches received treatment that would have seemed like science fiction to doctors in the First World War. Sulfur drugs prevented most infections from establishing. Penicillin treated those infections that did develop. Blood transfusions replaced lost blood. Better surgical techniques repaired damage that previous generations would have considered unsurvivable. The combination transformed battlefield medicine. Survival rates told the story. About 50% of wounded soldiers in the Second World War survived their injuries, compared to only 4% in the First World War just 2 decades earlier. The improvement resulted from many factors, but antibacterial drugs were among the most important. They gave wounded men the time they needed to reach surgeons who could repair the damage. The Japanese military medical system, by contrast, struggled throughout the war. Not only did Japanese forces lack adequate supplies of sulfur drugs, they also faced severe shortages of basic medical equipment, morphine for pain relief, and trained medical personnel. The Bushido Code emphasized fighting to the death rather than surrendering, which meant Japanese soldiers often fought until they died rather than seeking treatment that might save them. On isolated Pacific islands where Japanese garrisons became cut off from resupply, medical conditions deteriorated catastrophically. Soldiers subsisted on minimal rations that led to beriberi and other nutritional deficiencies. Wounds went untreated, dysentery spread unchecked. Malaria incapacitated entire units. Some Japanese formations became 90%, combat ineffective due to disease and malnutrition. American forces landing on these islands sometimes found Japanese soldiers too weak from illness to fight effectively. The contrast was stark. American troops carried sulfur drugs, atabrine for malaria, vitamin supplements, and comprehensive medical support. Japanese troops had courage and determination but lacked the material resources to survive the diseases that warfare inevitably brings. The disparity extended beyond antibacterial drugs. American military medicine in the Second World War represented a comprehensive system. Every division included a medical battalion of approximately 1,000 personnel to support 14,000 combat troops. Medical officers developed evacuation protocols that moved wounded men from frontline aid stations to rear-area hospitals in carefully timed stages, each providing more sophisticated care. Air evacuation, pioneered during the war, allowed critically wounded soldiers to reach advanced medical facilities within hours rather than days. Hospital ships brought the most severely injured back to the United States for extended treatment and rehabilitation. The entire system operated on the principle that every soldier's life was worth extraordinary effort to save. The Japanese military operated under different principles. Resources were scarce. Medical care was often rudimentary. The emphasis was on maintaining combat effectiveness, not on saving individual lives. Wounded soldiers who could not return to duty quickly were sometimes left behind when units moved. The contrast in medical philosophy reflected deeper differences in how the two nations viewed their servicemen. By 1945, sulfur drugs had saved hundreds of thousands of lives. The exact number is impossible to calculate, but medical historians estimate that antibacterial drugs prevented at least 70% of the wound infections that would have occurred in the absence of treatment. Given that perhaps 30 to 40% of untreated infections proved fatal, sulfur drugs likely saved tens of thousands of American servicemen alone. The British used sulfur drugs extensively throughout the war. Their casualty statistics showed similar improvements in survival rates. Canadian, Australian, and other Allied forces also benefited from antibacterial treatment that previous generations lacked. The cumulative impact across all Allied forces probably reached into the hundreds of thousands of lives saved. Gerhard Domach, whose research had initiated the sulfur drug revolution, received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1939. The German government, angered by the awarding of the 1935 Nobel Peace Prize to Karl von Ossietzky, a German pacifist critic of the Nazi regime, forbade German citizens from accepting Nobel Prizes. The Gestapo arrested Domach when he attempted to accept the honor. He was forced to write a letter declining the prize. The money, which had already been deposited in Swedish accounts, was eventually redistributed according to Nobel Foundation rules. Domach did not receive the prize money, but in 1947, after the war ended, he travelled to Stockholm and accepted the medal and diploma for the 1939 prize. The Nobel Committee acknowledged his discovery had revolutionized medicine. Domach continued his research after the war, working on chemotherapy for tuberculosis and cancer. He developed thiosemicarbazones and isonicotinic acid hydrazide for treating tuberculosis, extending his legacy of developing drugs that fought previously untreatable diseases. He died in April 1964 at the age of 68, having lived to see antibacterial medicine become commonplace. The sulfur drugs he pioneered were gradually superseded by penicillin and later antibiotics that proved more effective and safer. By the 1950s, sulfur drugs were no longer frontline antibacterial agents for most conditions. They remained useful for treating urinary tract infections, and preventing infection of burn wounds. But newer drugs dominated medical practice, yet the legacy of sulfur drugs extended far beyond their specific medical applications. They proved that systematic chemical research could produce drugs that selectively killed bacteria without harming human tissue. They demonstrated that mass production of synthetic pharmaceuticals could save lives on a scale previously unimaginable. They showed that scientific medicine, properly resourced and organized, could change the equation of human suffering. The soldiers who carried sulfanilamide powder in their first aid kits rarely understood the science behind the yellowish-white substance they dusted into their wounds. They knew only that the medics said it would prevent infection, and that men who used it seemed to survive wounds that would have killed soldiers a generation earlier. That practical knowledge was sufficient. Private Holloway recovered fully from his thigh wound. He spent 6 weeks in a hospital in Australia, then returned to his unit for the campaigns in New Guinea and the Philippines. He was wounded twice more before the war ended, both times minor injuries that healed without complication. Each time, sulfur drugs prevented infection from taking hold. After the war, he returned to Ohio, married, worked as a machinist, raised 3 children. He lived until 1998, reaching the age of 76. He never forgot the night on Guadalcanal when Doc Martinez dusted that powder into his wound. He never forgot the smell of the jungle, the fear, the understanding that he should have died but somehow survived. Decades later, when his granddaughter asked him what had been the most important weapon of the war, he thought for a long moment before answering, not the rifles or the tanks or the aircraft carriers, though all of those mattered, not even the atomic bomb, terrible and decisive as it was. The most important weapon, he said, was so small it fit in an envelope, a yellowish-white powder that cost almost nothing to make and saved more lives than could ever be counted. In thousands of military cemeteries across the Pacific, Europe, North Africa, and Southeast Asia, markers stand over graves of men who died despite the best medicine of their era. But for every grave, there are perhaps 2 or 3 men who survived wounds that would have killed them in any previous conflict. Those survivors came home, built families, lived full lives that 1918 medicine could never have given them. The mathematics of survival had changed fundamentally. Bacterial infections, which had killed soldiers throughout human history, had finally met their match, not in heroic surgery or brilliant tactics, but in a simple chemical compound that blocked bacterial reproduction long enough for human immune systems to win the fight. The Japanese military learned this lesson too late. By the time they attempted to establish domestic sulfur drug production, the war had turned decisively against them. Resources that might have gone to pharmaceutical manufacturing went instead to aircraft and ammunition. Japanese soldiers continued fighting with extraordinary determination but inadequate medical support, a disparity that cost tens of thousands of lives. When the war ended in August 1945, the world had changed in countless ways. Nuclear weapons had demonstrated that humanity could destroy itself. The Holocaust had revealed the depths of human cruelty. The war's cost, perhaps 70 to 85 million dead, defied comprehension. But amid the destruction and horror, one quiet triumph persisted. Medicine had learned to fight infections that killed indiscriminately across all earlier wars. Sulfur drugs, and the antibiotics that followed, represented a permanent advance in human capability. Wars might still kill millions, but bacterial infections would never again cut through armies the way they had throughout history. That single change saved more lives in subsequent decades than could ever be calculated. In hospital wards across America in the years after 1945, doctors treated pneumonia, meningitis, and dozens of other bacterial infections with antibiotics that had not existed a generation earlier. Mothers survived childbirth at rates that would have seemed miraculous to their own mothers. Children recovered from illnesses that had been death sentences in living memory. The Second World War had accelerated medical progress by decades. The urgent need to save wounded soldiers drove research, production, and distribution of antibacterial drugs on an unprecedented scale. What began as a laboratory curiosity in 1932 became by 1945 a cornerstone of modern medicine that saved millions of lives and continues saving them today. The story contained no dramatic battlefield heroics, no last stands against impossible odds. Instead, it told of careful observation, methodical research, and the determination to find chemical compounds that could selectively harm bacteria while sparing human tissue. Gerhard Domag testing red dyes on infected mice. The Pasteur Institute researchers discovering that sulfanilamide was the active compound, American pharmaceutical companies scaling up production to supply millions of soldiers. Each step built on the previous one. Each advance opened new possibilities. The result was a transformation in military medicine that extended far beyond military applications. The sulfur drugs developed for combat proved equally valuable for civilian medicine. The production infrastructure built to supply armies continued operating after the war, manufacturing antibacterial drugs for general use. Private Holloway, recovering in that Australian hospital in 1943, represented hundreds of thousands of soldiers whose survival depended on a yellow powder they barely understood. They trusted that the medics knew what they were doing. They followed instructions to dust their wounds and swallow their tablets, and they survived at rates their fathers and grandfathers, fighting in earlier wars, could never have imagined. The Japanese soldiers who faced American forces without adequate medical support fought with courage equal to any in history. But courage alone could not overcome the material disparity that sulfur drugs represented. An American soldier wounded in the leg had perhaps a 95% chance of surviving the infection that might follow. A Japanese soldier with the same wound faced odds closer to 50-50, dependent entirely on his immune system's ability to fight bacteria without chemical assistance. Over the course of a long campaign involving thousands of casualties, that difference compounded into overwhelming advantage. American units maintained combat effectiveness because wounded men returned to duty after treatment. Japanese units bled strength with every engagement because their wounded often died or remained permanently disabled. The disparity showed most clearly on isolated islands where Japanese forces, cut off from resupply, faced disease and starvation, while American forces received regular supplies of food, medicine, and replacement personnel. By 1945, sulfur drugs had become so commonplace in Allied medicine that their revolutionary nature was already fading from consciousness. Soldiers took them for granted, the way earlier generations had taken quinine or morphine for granted. The drugs simply worked. They prevented infections. They saved lives. That was sufficient. Medical officers compiled statistics showing the dramatic improvement in survival rates. But those numbers meant little to individual soldiers focused on surviving the next firefight. The broader implications, the transformation of military medicine, the proof that chemical compounds could fight bacteria, all that remained for historians to assess after the war ended. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.